My name is Lisa, I'm 24 years old, a recent college graduate, and just beginning to build my career. The story I want to share starts with the house my mother left me after she passed away from lung cancer 6 years ago. My mom was an incredibly thoughtful and forward-thinking woman. Even before her diagnosis, she meticulously planned everything to ensure I wouldn't have to worry about my future. The house was her own property, purchased before she married my father, and fortunately she left it to me in her will with a heartfelt message. You will always have a home, no matter what happens. Our family used to be happy until my father decided to leave my mother and me for another woman when I was just 12 years old. There were no arguments, no battles over property or custody. He simply left. The only thing he provided was a savings account to cover my college tuition, perhaps as his way of fulfilling his responsibility. After that, he remarried a woman named Nancy, and they had a daughter, Sarah, who is 10 years younger than me. Although I visited them a few times at their rented apartment, I always felt like an outsider. Nancy never hid her discomfort with my presence, even as she tried to maintain a polite demeanor. As for my father, he was often working, claiming it was to provide for his new family. But it was clear there was little room left for me in his heart. My mother, on the other hand, was my greatest source of strength. She worked as a financial manager and earned a good income, but after her cancer diagnosis, she left her job to focus on treatment. I was 18 years old when she passed away, just weeks before I was set to leave the state for college. Losing her left me reeling. But I reminded myself that she had done everything to prepare me for life without her. It was her love and resilience that gave me the strength to move forward. From that moment, I knew that the house wasn't just an inheritance. It was a place filled with all the love my mother had poured into me. My mother, Catherine, was always a meticulous and forward-thinking woman. From a young age, I would watch her jot down detailed notes in her notebook, planning every aspect of our lives. She often said, "You can't control everything in life, but you can prepare the best you can to face it." Those words became etched in my mind when she was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 18. Even knowing her illness was not easily curable, she remained calm, dedicating her remaining time to ensuring my future was secure. She sold off unnecessary assets to settle any debts, leaving the house as her final gift to me, along with her message. Lisa, this is a place you can always call home, no matter what happens. During the 4 years she battled the disease, I witnessed her incredible resilience. She endured the pain of chemotherapy and the long days spent in the hospital, yet she never complained or gave up. Even in her final days when her strength had all but faded, she reminded me about her will and how to manage the house. "I'm doing everything so you won't have to worry," she said. As I held her hand tightly, tears streaming down my face, it was at that moment I realized how deep her love was. So much so that she put my happiness above her own suffering. When she passed away, it felt like my world had collapsed. The house became the only place that made me feel like she was still with me. Every corner carried her presence. From the paintings she had carefully hung on the walls, to the garden she tended so lovingly. I would often sit in her old armchair, looking out the window at the blooming flowers she had planted, feeling the warmth of the memories we had shared. She didn't just leave me a house, she left me a legacy of love and sacrifice. Whenever I think back to those days, I know I must keep moving forward and protect the priceless gift my mother gave her entire life to provide for me. This house isn't just a place to live, it's a reminder that I am stronger than I ever believed, just like my mother always was. My father, Robert, was once an important part of our small family, but that all changed when I was 9 years old. The day he packed his suitcase and left us for another woman, everything seemed to fall apart. There were no arguments, no tears, and no signs of regret from him. Just a brief hug and a vague promise that everything will be okay. From that moment on, my mother, Catherine, carried the weight of the family alone. She became both mother and father, never letting me feel like I was lacking love or support. My father remarried fairly quickly to a woman named Nancy. I met her a few times during brief visits. Nancy never made much of an effort to make me feel welcome. Though she tried to maintain a polite exterior, the distance was always evident in her tone and the way she looked at me. As for Robert, while he still called to check in occasionally, his attention faded, especially after he and Nancy had a daughter, Sarah, who was 10 years younger than me. I became an outsider in his new family, a visitor, and the growing distance only reinforced the feeling that I no longer belonged in his world. Even so, I've always appreciated that he paid my entire college tuition up front. Perhaps it was his way of trying to make up for the responsibilities he couldn't fulfill as a father. But that financial support couldn't fill the emotional void he left behind in my heart. What hurt me the most was what I discovered later. During the 4 years I was away at college, he had lied to Nancy, claiming that my mother's house was his property and that he had been generous enough to let my mother and me live there. The fact that he could fabricate such a story about the place that held all my mother's memories and love was something I could never forgive. He turned my mother's legacy into a tool to sustain his new life with Nancy, without any regard for how it would affect me. That betrayal made me feel like I had lost not just a father, but also the last shred of trust I had left in him. Nancy, my stepmother, always carried an air of false sophistication, making it easy for others to believe she was a kind and considerate woman. During the early years of her family living in my mother's house, Nancy worked hard to build a warm image. She often prepared elaborate dinners, invited me to her small social gatherings, and frequently referred to me as Robert's lovely stepdaughter. But after I graduated and returned to the home my mother had left me, that facade slowly began to crumble. From the moment I walked through the door, Nancy discreetly showed her displeasure. Comments like, "Lisa, how long do you plan to stay?" or "Don't you think it's time to live independently?" became more frequent. Though I knew she was trying to push me out of the house, I stayed calm and tried to maintain a good relationship, thinking this was still my father's family. Everything changed, however, after the offensive phone call Nancy made while they were vacationing in the Maldives. Her harsh tone and cutting remarks, calling me a freeloader and a burden, revealed what she truly thought of me. Sophie, my half-sister, had once been my little companion during my visits home. I remembered the days we'd draw together or share funny stories about school. But under Nancy's influence, Sophie began to change. As Nancy grew colder and more negative toward me, Sophie became distant. She started referring to me as her when talking to her friends, and would pass by me as if I were invisible. She had been drawn into her mother's selfish manipulation, and that hurt me more than Nancy's cruel words ever could. Living under the same roof became more strained with each passing day. Nancy employed subtle, silent attacks, such as deliberately ruining my clothes in the laundry, moving my mother's belongings to obscure corners, and even attempting to redecorate the house. Sophie, rather than standing by me, began mocking my feelings, as if they didn't matter. When Nancy and her family returned from their vacation, her fury erupted upon discovering I had changed the locks and packed their belongings into the garage. She screamed that I was ungrateful, a selfish child, and even threatened to call the police to reclaim her house. But what angered me the most was my father's silence. He stood there, saying nothing, as if he couldn't bear to confront the truth. That final confrontation with Nancy made it clear to me that reconciliation was impossible. When she attempted to feign friendliness in the hopes of persuading me to let her family stay, all I felt was disgust at her insincerity. I stood firm, and in the end, Nancy had no choice but to accept defeat. They left, taking all the belongings I had carefully packed for them, along with their barely disguised resentment. That moment helped me realize that Nancy had never truly seen me as part of her family. To her, I was merely an obstacle standing in the way of what she wanted. And Sophie, though still young, chose to side with her mother rather than preserve our sisterly bond. The betrayal was unforgettable, but I understood that protecting my self-respect and my mother's legacy mattered more than anything else. My childhood was far from easy. I witnessed my father, Robert, leave our family when I was just 9 years old. At that age, I was too young to understand why he chose to abandon my mom and me to build a new life with Nancy. My mother, Catherine, never let me see her pain. Instead, she buried herself in work, doing everything she could to ensure I had a stable and full life, so I wouldn't feel the absence of my father. But nothing could hide the emptiness that lingered in the house after his departure. Life became even harder when my mom was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 14. For 4 years I watched her fight the disease every single day, maintaining an optimistic spirit despite the pain and physical toll it took on her. Every time she smiled and said, "You have to be stronger than anything, Lisa," I knew she was putting all her hope in me, wanting me to live for both of us. Sure as hell you did. When she passed away at 18, just weeks before I was set to leave for college, it felt like my entire world had fallen apart. Even so, I decided to let my father, Nancy, and Sophie stay in my mother's house while I went to school, partly because I couldn't think of a better solution at the time. They helped clean and take care of the house in my absence, and initially everything seemed fine. But, as I've shared, the events that unfolded later made me realize that my kindness had been taken advantage of. During that time I kept in contact with them, thinking I was making an effort to build a family bond, but now, looking back, I see that I spent far too much time trying to fit into a group of people who never truly saw me as part of their family. The memories of my childhood with my mom have become my sole source of strength, helping me overcome the pain and protect the legacy she left behind, even if it meant standing up against my own family. When I decided to let my father, Nancy, and Sophie live in my mother's house, I believed it was the best way to keep the house safe while I was away at college. In the beginning, everything seemed to go well. Nancy appeared to be a thoughtful stepmother, often cooking family meals and inviting me to join her for small gatherings. Sophie, my half-sister, started to warm up to me, frequently pulling me into her room to show me her latest drawings or share funny stories from school. My father, despite being busy with work, seemed to be making an effort to spend more time rebuilding our relationship. I began to feel, though a bit awkwardly, that we were slowly becoming a family. But the first signs of pretense began to surface when I came home for my first holiday break. Nancy would make subtle comments about how I needed to become independent soon, or start looking for my own place. Initially, I brushed it off as a misunderstanding. But as the breaks passed, her attitude became increasingly apparent. She began rearranging my mother's belongings, claiming it was time for a fresh look. Sentimental items, like my mother's favorite vase, were shoved into obscure corners and replaced with cold, impersonal decorations of Nancy's choosing. Sophie, once a sweet and eager little sister, also changed. She no longer greeted me enthusiastically when I came home. Instead, she grew distant, even cold, and treated me as though I were a stranger in my own home. One day I overheard Nancy whispering to Sophie in the kitchen, saying that I was just a freeloader, and that the house belonged to their family. Sophie quietly agreed, and at that moment I realized I had been pushed out of the family dynamic they had created. I tried to maintain the peace, convincing myself that the tension was temporary, but when I discovered that my father had lied to Nancy, telling her the house belonged to him, everything became crystal clear. Nancy's efforts to appear friendly weren't about building a harmonious family. They were about taking over the house. Under Nancy's influence, Sophie began to view me as an obstacle, someone who didn't belong. Each time I tried to confront my father for answers, he would evade the conversation, repeatedly saying, "It'll all work out." But it never did. Instead, the house gradually turned into a foreign place where I, the rightful owner, was treated as an outsider. The memories of my mother in this house continued to remind me of her love and sacrifice, but the people living here made me feel like I had lost everything. After graduating from college, I returned home with excitement and a sense of comfort, thinking I was about to start a new chapter in the place I've always called home. But as I stepped onto the familiar porch, the smile on my face quickly faded. My old key no longer fit the lock. I tried again and again, but it was no use. My heart sank as I realized something was wrong. I hadn't been informed of any changes, and a vague sense of unease began to creep in. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments Nancy appeared, her face showing a mix of surprise and discomfort, as if she hadn't expected me to return. When I asked why the locks had been changed without my knowledge, she gave a dismissive response, saying it was for security reasons. There was no apology, no intention of giving me a new key. I stepped into the house that had once been my sanctuary. But a cold, unfamiliar feeling engulfed me. The interior had been completely altered. My mother's photos were gone, replaced by framed pictures of Nancy and Sophie. Even my mother's beloved armchair had been replaced. That evening I tried to keep the peace during dinner, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Nancy constantly threw pointed remarks my way, while Sophie wouldn't even look at me. The breaking point came when I mentioned my plans to start my new job and stay at the house to save money. Nancy, with a mocking tone and icy stare, bluntly asked, "Lisa, isn't it time you found your own place? You've graduated, you shouldn't keep relying on this family." When Nancy finally responded, "You should keep relying on this family," her words cut through my pride like a knife. I tried to respond calmly, but the trembling in my voice betrayed the emotions I was struggling to contain. The insults didn't stop there. The next day I received a phone call from Nancy while she and her family were vacationing in the Maldives. Her voice was filled with venom as she accused me of being a freeloader and demanded that I leave their house. Hearing those words, I felt completely shattered. Nancy, who had once pretended to be kind, no longer hid her true intentions. What hurt even more was hearing Sophie's laughter in the background, as if she wholeheartedly agreed with everything her mother said. I sat silently in the house, now feeling like a stranger in what should have been my home. But as the anger rose within me, I realized I couldn't let them continue trampling on my mother's legacy. I decided it was time to act. I wouldn't let them turn my mother's house into a place they could manipulate as they pleased. The next day I changed all the locks, moved their belongings into the garage, and prepared myself to face whatever came next. I had endured enough. It was time to protect what was mine. Realizing I had no other choice, I decided to take action to protect what was rightfully mine. Early the next morning, I contacted a locksmith and requested that all the locks in the house be changed. When the locksmith finished, I held the new keys tightly in my hand, feeling both relief and resolve. This wasn't just about securing the house, it was a statement that I wouldn't let anyone trample on my mother's legacy. Then, as soon as I'd packed my things into a nearby stable and driven off, I came to the realization. Next, I began clearing out my father, Nancy, and Sophie's belongings. I went room by room, carefully gathering everything that belonged to them: clothes, books, and even the decorative items Nancy had used to replace my mother's. This wasn't just a physical task, it was a way of reclaiming control. Every item I packed into boxes reminded me that they didn't belong here. By the end of the day, everything had been neatly packed and placed in the garage, ready for them to take. That night, I sat in the familiar living room, looking around at a house that was slowly returning to the way my mother had built it. Her photos were back on the walls, and her old armchair had been restored to its rightful place. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace amidst the storm that I knew wasn't entirely over. The next day they returned. When my father's car pulled up in front of the house, I watched through the window as Nancy's face shifted from surprise to anger. She stormed out of the car and shouted, "Lisa, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Calmly, I opened the door and faced them. "I've packed your things," I said firmly. "They're in the garage. This is my house and I'm not allowing anyone to stay here anymore." Inside I felt like you were spending the summer here. Nancy's face turned red with rage as she yelled that I was an ungrateful child and a disgrace. Sophie stood behind her mother, glaring at me with contempt, while my father just stood there, head bowed, saying nothing. When Nancy continued to berate me, I cut her off. "That's enough, Nancy. This house belongs to me. My mother left it to me, and the only reason you've been here is because I allowed it. But that ends now." Finally my father spoke, his voice weak. "Lisa, do you really have to take it this far? We're family." I looked directly at him, overwhelmed with disappointment. "Family?" I asked. "You stood by and let Nancy insult me. You even let her believe this house belonged to her. Family doesn't do that to each other." After more arguments, they had no choice but to leave. As their car disappeared down the street, I closed the door and felt a relief I had never known before. My mother's house was finally back in the hands of its rightful owner. And I knew I had done the right thing to protect it. When Linda stepped out of the car in her expensive dress and designer sunglasses, a flicker of confusion crossed her face as she noticed the new locks. But she quickly regained her usual confidence, striding toward the door with a fake smile. "Lisa, darling," Linda said sweetly, her voice dripping with manipulation. "I don't understand what's going on. But surely we can talk about this as a family? Right?" She said about remaking the locks, and with care, slowly and carefully pushing 2 fingers from the gate, she pointed Linda to the lock. I stood on the porch, my expression calm, though a storm raged inside me. "There's nothing to talk about, Linda," I replied coldly. "Your belongings have already been packed and are in the garage. You should take them and leave." Linda froze for a moment, before quickly adopting a look of surprise mixed with feigned hurt. "Lissa, you're joking, right? You can't seriously be throwing your family out of the house like this. We've lived here as a family for the past 4 years." She tried to sound sincere, but her shifting eyes and trembling voice betrayed her. "Don't call me darling, Linda," I said, staring directly at her. "This is my house. My mother worked her entire life to build this place and left it to me. Not to you. The only reason you've been living here is because I allowed it, but that ends now." My father Robert stepped forward, raising a hand as if to mediate. "Lisa, I know this isn't right, but you don't have to make things so tense. We can handle this peacefully." I turned to my father, feeling a mix of pain and disappointment. "Peacefully?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You lied to Linda, letting her believe this house belonged to her. You stayed silent while she insulted me, even planning to throw me out of the home my mother left me. Is that what you call peace?" At this point, Linda lost her composure and shouted, "We've done everything to take care of this house. Can't you see that? We've made it so much better." I let out a bitter laugh. "Better, by erasing everything my mother cherished? By replacing all her memories with yours? Stop fooling yourself, Linda. Your goal was never to take care of this house. It was to take it over." Linda's face twisted with anger, while my father, as usual, hung his head in silence. After an unproductive back and forth, I pointed toward the garage. "Take your things and leave. I won't repeat myself." They had no choice. Linda hurled insults, Sophie sobbed, and my father quietly helped load their belongings into the car. As they drove away, I stood at the door, feeling a sense of lightness in my chest. At last, I had reclaimed not just the house, but my dignity and control over my life. This house is mine, and I won't let anyone take it from me again. After the door closed behind my father, Linda, and Sophie for the last time, I knew my relationship with them had ended completely. No more fake calls from my father pretending to care, no more subtle insults from Linda, and no more shallow laughter from Sophie at family gatherings. I decided not to look back because maintaining contact would only prolong the pain I was no longer willing to endure. In the days that followed, the house felt unusually quiet. Yet instead of feeling empty, I felt relieved. I spent my time rearranging everything, putting my mother's photos back in their rightful places, and carefully cleaning the keepsakes Linda had tried to erase. I replanted the rose bushes my mother had lovingly cared for in the garden. Each blooming flower seemed to remind me that, despite everything, the spirit of my mother still lingered in this house. I threw myself into my new job at the financial firm. The busy work days helped me forget the hurt my family had caused. I quickly adjusted to my new environment, built good relationships with my coworkers, and earned recognition from my boss. The job not only provided me with financial stability, but also gave me a renewed sense of self-worth. I gradually built a new life, entirely separate from the shadows of my past. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. Sometimes I received calls from unknown numbers. I knew they were my father's attempts to reach out, but I never answered. His messages of apology, whether long or short, were left unread. I understood that no amount of regret could change the fact that he had chosen Linda and deceit over protecting me. Cutting ties wasn't just about safeguarding the house, it was about protecting my heart from further harm. I turned away from him. I still party with him in the unit, refusing to see his father. 2 months later, I received a handwritten letter from my father. In it, he detailed the struggles his family was facing after leaving the house, but I felt no sympathy. Instead, I felt peace. I had done what I needed to do to protect my mother's legacy, and that was all that mattered. That letter, like the memories of my father and his family, was left behind, no longer holding any weight in my life. Now, I live a life entirely under my control. The house is my space, a sanctuary for healing and growth. With each passing day, I feel the freedom and peace I fought so hard to reclaim. Cutting ties wasn't a loss. It was a way to rediscover myself and start building a future worthy of my mother's love and sacrifice. After completely cutting ties with my father and his family, I began focusing on emotional and mental recovery. The house, once a source of pain and conflict, now became a sanctuary where I could rebuild my life. I decided that this house would not just be a physical space, but a symbol of the freedom and strength I had reclaimed. I started by redecorating each room to reflect my own style. The old, dull walls were repainted with soft, calming colors, bringing warmth and peace to the space. I chose artwork that I loved, and small decorative pieces that reminded me of my mom and the happy days we had shared. The living room, which had once been the center of tension, was transformed into a bright and cozy space, where I could relax with a cup of tea and my favorite book. The rose garden in the yard, neglected for so long, was revived, and bloomed as beautifully as it had when my mom tended to it. Each blossoming flower felt like a piece of her memory coming back to life. This renewed space brought me the peace I had been longing for. I began to appreciate the small joys in life: quiet mornings by the window, afternoons spent gardening, and evenings writing in my journal to document the journey I had taken. With each passing day, I realized that letting go of toxic relationships was not a loss, but a way to create room for growth and genuine happiness. I also learned to open my heart to new people. Though still cautious, I started participating in local social activities like yoga classes, cooking workshops, and even joining a book club. These new connections taught me that family isn't limited to blood ties. It can be the people who share your joys and sorrows, who stand by you without judgment. From this house I rebuilt my life, stronger and more independent. Looking back, I know that everything that happened, no matter how painful, was a valuable lesson. I learned that letting go isn't a sign of weakness, but a way to protect yourself and honor what truly matters. Every morning when I wake up in this house, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for my mom. She gave me more than just a place to live. She left me a legacy of love and sacrifice. And now, I can proudly say I've turned this house into a space filled with joy, hope, and the freedom I truly deserve. The lesson from this story is the importance of protecting your self-worth and letting go of toxic relationships. Carol courageously faced betrayal from her own family, refusing to let them continue to exploit and hurt her. It reminds us that sometimes cutting ties with unhealthy relationships is the only way to find peace and build true happiness. Life becomes meaningful when we stand up for what belongs to us and keep moving forward. Share your thoughts on this story. What would you do if you were in a similar situation? Don't forget to follow the channel for more inspiring stories about life and family, where each lesson offers powerful inspiration. We'd love to hear from you.